Hello. Can you send someone over here right away, please?
What's the emergency?
My ex-husband just broke in and now he's...
Okay, what's his name?
O.J. Simpson.
Is he the sportscaster?
Yes, that's right.
Has he threatened you?
I think you know his record.
What are you doing there, Nicole? You calling 911?
Dukakis not only opposes the death penalty, he allowed first-degree murderers to have weekend passes from prison. One was Willie Horton, who murdered a boy in a robbery, stabbing him 19 times. Despite a life sentence, Horton received 10 weekend passes from prison. Horton fled, kidnapped a young couple, stabbing the man and repeatedly raping his girlfriend.
The newly released 911 police emergency tapes that appear to portray a chilling side of O.J. Simpson's personality have law enforcement taking a closer look at how domestic violence cases are handled.
26-year-old Victoria Herring cried as she told me how her husband beat her Monday night because he was jealous. According to a Gwinnett County police report, Alcaviz Herring had Victoria in a headlock and dragged her to his car. Herring then threatened Victoria, saying she would become another Nicole Simpson, and kept telling her he would kill her.
That's when all of my facial injuries occurred, my broken arm.
Victoria was 2 months pregnant. She lost the baby after the beating.
This battered woman sees her life paralleling Nicole Simpson's. Many batterers are probably telling their wives, see, it can happen to you, too. Jack Harper, News Center 5.
Tell me what I gotta do to be that guy. Said a price go down, she ever fuck a black guy. Or do anal, or do a gangbang. It's kinda crazy, that's all considered the same thing. Well, I guess a lot of niggas do gangbang. And if we run trains, we all in the same gang. Runaway slaves all on a chain gang. Bang, 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 bang.
Let's get a female jogger, I shout into the twilight, looking at the middle-class thighs pumping past me, cadres of bitches who deserve to die for thinking they're better than me. You ain't better than nobody, bitch. The Rock begs my hand to hold it. It says, come on, man. TW Pitbull, JD and me grab the bitch. Ugly, big-nosed white bitch, but she's beautiful because she's white. She's beautiful because she's skinny. She's beautiful because she's gonna die because her daddy's gonna cry, bitch. I bring the rock down on her head. Sounds dull and flat like the time I busted the kitten's head. The blood is real and red. My dick rises. I tear off her bra, feel her perfect pink breast like Brooke Shields, like the bitches in Playboy shit. I come all over myself. I bring the rock down, the sound has rhythm. Hip-hop ain't gonna stop till your face sees what I see every day. Walls of blood, walls of blood.
The 5 young men were shown, named, and shamed by local politicians outraged by the gang rape allegations.
They should be more afraid of us today than of the police.
But the alleged victim of a gunpoint sex assault at Osborne Playground now has recanted.
Get caught so then he won't harm any other innocent people.
Now these guys are going in after convicted rapists.
Convicted rapists.
And these guys risk their lives all the time. America's most wanted. Alice Sebold. Okay, let's go. Let me tell you something, bro. You're in big, big trouble.
Convicted rapist.
Mr. Broadwater cannot get those 16 years back. But based upon my review of motions and the representations of counsel, this court grants defendant's motion. They take his conviction, and the indictment is hereby dismissed. Thank you, Judge. That concludes the decision.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you, Judge.
I couldn't help but cry. The relief that a district attorney of that magnitude would side with me concerning this case. It's so profound. I did everything I could do to always show people that, hey, I'm never that type of guy. I never could be that type of guy. A lot of doors been slammed in my face for jobs. She wanted children. I wouldn't bring children in the world because of this. And now we're past the age we can't have children.
Ruined his life. His life has been ruined over this, you know, not just incarceration, but wrongfully being labeled a sex offender. These are things that he will never get back. An astonishingly simple case of injustice.
One question during trial. Do you remember seeing the accuser in court?
Yes. She got on the stand, and I remember the question was asked, do you see the perpetrator in the room that did this crime to you? And she said, yes, that black man right there. And I looked around, and I said, I'm the only black man in the courtroom. Matter of fact, I'm the only black person in the whole courtroom.
Anthony Broadwater. Context of White Supremacy. Gus T. Renegade. The Black O.J. Simpson. In for another broadcast, hopefully to share constructive information on the system of white supremacy. Today's date, Monday, February 7, 2022. So I have been told. Before we get started, definitely for this program, two things. Number one, Neely Fuller Jr., he says regularly, first time, last time. Make sure before, when you first meeting or seeing each other, and oh, he's cool, and oh, she's cute, and blah, blah, blah. Hey, no touching. This is done. We are not doing that. Nobody is putting hands. We can have disagreements. Talk about that in advance. Has this been a problem with you before? You can talk about all of that up front. First time, last time. Number two, what does that moron say? Regular. He's been saying it for some years now. He says it at the end of the programs. He says, how does it go? He says, sobriety would be best. Our guest for today's program, I've said for years, chronologically, if you listen to the cows in the order of the programs in terms of their release, that's the best way you'll learn a lot. So if you can hang tight for 1 week, today's broadcast will fit beautifully with the program for 1 week from today, when our guest will be Kyla Schuler. She is the author of The Trouble with White Women. The first paragraph in the foreword to that book, it says, the biggest stumbling block in black women's journey to fly the flag of feminism has been white women. Somewhere a white woman is talking about how we all need to be united as women, regardless of race or creed, and somewhere a black woman is giving that white woman a side eye. Kyla Schuler, in fact, that'll be on February 14. We'll be talking about her book, The Trouble with White Women. Anywho, I guess for today's program, I was thinking like, man, what is our record? We've been here almost 13 years. What is our record on women's studies in terms of programs? And I said, let's see. So we've had Danielle McGuire. She was with us to talk about her book, At the Dark End of the Street, Black Women, Rape, and Resistance, A New History of the Civil Rights Movement from Rosa Parks to the Rise of Black Power. We had Glenda Elizabeth Gilmore. She talked about gender and Jim Crow, women and the politics of white supremacy in North Carolina. We had Catherine Fossel on the program. She talked about her biography, Subversive Southerner Ann Braden and the Struggle for Racial Justice in the Cold War South. We had Linda Rehnquist Dorr, White Women, Rape, and the Power of Race in Virginia. Andrea Freeman, Skimmed, Breastfeeding, Race, and Injustice. And last one I'll give, this is not like exhaustive, just some of the books that came to mind specifically for the topic for today's broadcast. Dorothy Roberts, Killing the Black Body, Race, Reproduction, and the Meaning of Liberty. Not quite exemplary, but at least like a C-, D+, right? Our record, women's studies. Not exhaustive, just some of the content relative to today's broadcast. And I would add, book club selection that we just completed. That's how we got here today, kind of giving some context. We read Alice Sebold's Lucky. I don't have enough time to explain the whole introduction. Bill Cosby, Willie Horton, America's Most Wanted. Maybe we'll get into some of that detail as we go through the book. But Lucky specifically is how we got here. Alice Sebold's memoir, which describes her 1981 rape. She is a white woman. She was allegedly raped by a black male. Turns out Anthony Broadwater, that black male, convicted, serves 16 years, ended up being registered sex offender, and then it takes 40 years to find out, whoops, exonerated, junk science, racism, all this other, whatever you want to call it, colossal miscarriage of justice. Exoneration. You heard him at the end. As we were reading this memoir of Alice Sebold, literally days after the exoneration, one of our listeners said, man, this reminds me so much of the book, The Feminist War on Crime, The Unexpected Role of Women's Liberation in Mass Incarceration. I said, wow, that would be great. Let's see if we could get her on the program to further discuss. And wow, once you read the book, I thought of Alice Sebold, Lucky, Anthony Broadwater on about every other page, every registered sex offender, all of it. This vengeance, we're going to be punitive in punishing individuals for sex crimes. Wow, so much amazing information. Super excited that we could have her hang out with us on the broadcast. The author of the said scholarship that I've been reading and excited to chat about, joining us live, Professor Aya Gruber. Professor Gruber, are you with us, ma'am?
It's so great to be here, and let me say that I would like to give you an A+ on your critical feminist lineup that you've had.
Hey, I was willing to take a C, but wow, right on. And Kyla Schuler, maybe next week we'll get bumped up to a C+, B- maybe by next week, The Trouble with White Women. Thank you so much for hanging out with us this evening to discuss your phenomenal scholarship. Some of our listeners already know. They informed me. For folks who have not done the reading yet, anything that you would like to tell them about who you are and the great work that you do?
Sure, I do. I first want to say that, one thing I noticed in your introduction was that you mentioned Anthony Broadwater before Alice Sebold. And I think that's really important because even if you look up the most sympathetic articles to Anthony Broadwater, the headlines are always Alice Sebold, rapist was released, and just don't say his name, or man accused by Alice Sebold was finally released. And that to me is just really exemplary of, even in the fact that this is his story, that this was his life that was robbed from him, we still have, even among the sympathetic press, this dehumanization of the accused person by not even naming him, by naming instead the false accuser as the author, the famed author. And then there's this nameless person that has suffered an entire lifetime, disappeared because of her. So that was just really notable to me. My book, I think, I would categorize myself as, one of these feminists, and I think I could rightly say I'm a feminist, who, when I was in law school before I became a public defender, I was, really rightly, I think, concerned with the racism of policing, prosecution, imprisonment. I had a parent that was actually put in the Japanese internment camps during World War II, so I always had this kind of distrust of the state and its use of detention authority. But at the same time, I had always internalized this notion that to be a good feminist meant that the number one thing on your radar was men's private violence, particularly domestic violence and rape, that those were the most important things, and that the only way to address them was through prosecution and imprisonment. So, going into becoming a public defender, I felt this dilemma, oh my gosh, how I'm going to represent these terrible men accused of these crimes. And it was interesting because I was more worried about representing a man charged with misdemeanor domestic violence than I was representing somebody charged with murder. That fell into my, everybody needs a defense, the system is rigged, and we can have bad evidence and all these different things, but when it came to any crimes against women, I mean, even minor, it was like that carceral instinct kicked in. And when I finally became a public defender, I saw the system up close. You know, I was at a law school. I really looked at the systems that feminists had built to make a better, you know, more progressive, more enlightened criminal prosecution system. And I realized that, you know, it was just more of the same, more of this sort of revolving door that's not helping anybody, where you saw, you know, poor people of color, mostly men, mostly black men in the jurisdiction I was in, you know, just going in and out of the system, and nobody's really being helped by it. And I saw even women being hurt by it. So after I became an academic, I really wanted to dial down on where did this instinct come from that, despite everything we know is so horrific about American mass incarceration, you know, well-meaning feminists are still clinging to this idea that the linchpin of justice for women is, you know, really being prosecutorial when it comes to this subset of crimes. So that was kind of the inspiration for the book.
Spectacular. We'll try to get through as much detail as we can through the course of the text, give folks some chances to ask questions as well. For folks who have not seen you, are you classified as a white person or a non-white person?
I guess I could be classified as either, depending on like who you ask. So, I mean, I am half Japanese, right? Like, so I'm half Asian. I can pass for like many things. And so, you know, it's interesting. My, you know, everybody is rightly, I think, thinking about, you know, the perspective of people who are commenting on these issues, whether, you know, it's called situated knowledge or lived experience. And so I definitely think in terms of being somebody who is vulnerable to like the state and being incarcerated, I think, you know, Asian women and white women are probably the least vulnerable. So I would probably be a person who's not very vulnerable to being caged by the state. You know, so I can't write from that perspective of lived experience. That being said, I can write for the perspective of somebody who, although, you know, a critical race person from, you know, being very young, you know, had the perspective of being victimized by sexual assault. And even that, like, I could say wasn't really what formulated my opinion of like how carceral feminists should be. It really was just this notion of being a quote unquote good feminist. So I mean, I speak from that perspective of somebody who really felt dilemma over like, okay, well, if I believe in women's rights, I've got to be really, really tough on rape. And, you know, you've got to just give prosecutors more power. You've got to have these messaging campaigns. You really got to throw people in jail for domestic violence. Like, I had just internalized that set of beliefs through, you know, being in college and things like that. And they really were a set of beliefs that it shouldn't have thrown me into dilemma because there's nothing natural about them. It's not natural to look at a problem in the world like gender subordination or violence and just say, let's exact more state violence on people's bodies. It's not natural. It's just something that has been so drummed into, you know, women who want to be feminists' head, this very particular notion, and it is very, you know, very much a white feminist notion. It's a middle-class feminist notion, and it's also the notion that got most traction because it aligned with powerful political and neoliberal interests. I mean, it got drummed into my head too. So I guess I can talk from the perspective of somebody who had been taken in by that logic and shouldn't have been.
Wow. Thank you for the detail in your response, Professor Gruber. Am I pronouncing your name correct? Is it Gruber? Am I saying that right?
It's Gruber. Yeah, that's right.
Okay. To make sure I'm being accurate, you said you have one Japanese parent and you have one white parent?
Yeah. Well, he's like Eastern European Jew, but that's white, depending on who you, I guess depending on who you ask. But yeah. Okay. So, I mean, you know, but yeah, so that's sort of my personal background. which, just intersectionally, it brings its own set of issues, but it's certainly not the issue of the deep vulnerability of men of color, and particularly Black and Latino men in this country, to state-sanctioned violence. That's a phenomenon that's gendered and raced and extremely present.
For sure. I will see if I can get to the text here. Before I do, all of our guests, my definition I give, I use the term racism and the term white supremacy as synonyms, and I use the same definition for both terms. The definition I use is as follows: a global system of people who classify themselves as white and are dedicated to abusing and or subjugating everyone in the known universe whom they classify as not white. Do you think such a system exists? Do you think that definition is accurate?
I think that definition is accurate, but maybe, I would add a couple of things. One is that, I think whiteness is more than just individuals' intent too. It's an entire embedded structural system. And so you could really have a white person who says, I don't have a racist bone in my body. Like, I love Black people. And at the same time, every single choice they make and every single policy they believe in is a legacy of white supremacy, enslavement. So, I would say that. And the second thing I would say is interesting because I also think that, whiteness, it has to do with morphology and maybe, some people's perception of color of skin and all that. But it's also just a status. You can price it. If you're an economist, you can price it, how much being included in the concept of whiteness is, whether it's on the page or, again, like visually, or just, the circles you're allowed to belong to. And sometimes that whiteness can be conferred on people who are technically non-white, right? It's a fluid function. At one point, people from Poland in the United States and Italy were considered non-whites. And now, they're like card-carrying members of these white supremacist, white nationalist groups there in this country. And, you see a similar phenomenon in a way happening with Asians, with affirmative action debates and sort of like, crimes against Asians being used as, the fodder for these really carceral policies. You see kind of a whitening of that ethnic group. So I just would also say that it's both an intention and it's a construct and it's a history. So there's just many layers to it.
Right on. I guess my quick response would just be, I'm very intentional about system of people who classify as white, because so frequently, in my view, one individuals classified as white will do this deliberately to deceive and cause confusion. But many victims, non-white people, do this just because we're confused. We're still learning. But racism gets discussed as some sort of metaphor in a really ambiguous manner, or it will be attributed to previous policies, legacies, things that were done in the past, as opposed to these are things that individuals classified as white are doing right now. Just as you said, policies, how they vote, how they invest, all of that is directly related to why we have white supremacy racism in all areas of people activity all over the world, even though they will lie. I love Black people. I voted for Obama 3 times, and all the rest of it. That is very, very prominent, and I think a big part of the confusion. In fact, even related, as a Black male reading this text, I'm leaving out a big chunk of Black misandry that happened in the middle of my day that's directly related to the text. I'll see how the time goes. Maybe I'll share. But as a Black male reading this text, it was challenging at times for different reasons. But I want you to explain for our listeners the full title of the book, The Feminist War on Crime, the unexpected. Whew. Word of the day for the program is unexpected, boys and girls listening in. Unexpected. The unexpected role of women's liberation in mass incarceration. Can you kind of detail the title and what problem you wanted to address and maybe help solve in the writing of this book? And with your response, can you tell us unexpected? What do you mean when you say unexpected?
So that I'm really glad that you asked that, because so initially I was just going to call it the Feminist War on Crime. And where that comes from is, you know, when I did start getting involved as a defender in these courts that were built by feminists, like domestic violence courts, and it, you know, in rape trials where you can't bring your defense because there's these special evidence rules that, you know, only apply in these trials and that were championed by feminists, you know, I started like just seeing how people who I thought of as, you know, having a progressive pro-equality stance really contributed to this mass incarceration system that is like completely racist, but also like an outlier in the world, both in its just breadth and the inhumanity within prisons and the racial bias. And it just was like, I was like, oh my God, the feminists had their own war on crime through the years. All the energy about, you know, gender equality and women being oppressed went into sort of this punishment system that didn't seem to help women much, and frankly, didn't affect the very women who were architects of it, which were mostly privileged white women. So that was a feminist war on crime. And then the publisher said, well, I think we need a little colon after it. And so they suggested it to me. You know, I said something like the role of women's liberation in mass incarceration. And so then they came back to me and said, well, we want to say the unintentional role. And I said, I'm going to say unintentional, right? Because a lot of it was intentional. Like you were saying, like we can say some of it is system, we can say some of it is legacy, we can say some of it is the tough on crime politicians kind of co-opting the feminist movement and bringing it away from like, you know, distributing resources to the most vulnerable, marginalized women, to these, you know, pro-policing policies. We can say all that, but the fact of the matter is a lot of this from feminists themselves was very intentional and very intentionally racist. And I can give you an example of that in a second. That's actually not in my book. It's in a paper I'm writing now. But so I just wouldn't do it. And they're like, well, you need to say something or else people are just going to like really not like you even less if they're really into Me Too at this moment and Weinstein, and it seems like convictions are a prize for women's rights. And I'm like, okay, so for many people, understanding the role of feminism in the rise of racialized mass incarceration is going to be unexpected, right? You know, for others, it's going to be like, yeah, tell us something we don't know. So that was kind of the compromise position, was the unexpected.
Wow. I'm so glad you are hanging out with us this evening. So glad I got to ask that question. Wow, on so many levels. Before I get to my surprise, I'm so grateful when she shared, Professor Gruber, about the omission of Anthony Broadwater. That is exactly like, it is extremely deliberate when I say his name. And I try to say it at the beginning of the program. We did the book club. So for 2 months when we read Alice Sebold's book, I hashtagged his name every time for the title of the program, because I was noticing the same thing. Like, they're not even talking about this guy. He was, even if he didn't spend any time in jail, I didn't realize this until I read Professor Gruber's book. If he just had to be a registered sex offender for the last 40 years, that alone would have been like, oh my God, just that alone, not even counting 16 years in prison. And then, whoops. And then we can't even mention your name. You're just some random raping Negro, who didn't actually rape anybody, who also was a U.S. Marine. But no, you just the Negro who could have, or maybe didn't, or was falsely identified by Alice Sebold. Like, why? And these, as she said, are the sympathetic tellings of Anthony Broadwater. Like, wow. Anywho.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. Like, say his name, you know, like, why are you reporting? You know, and I get it. Okay, fine, she was 18, she couldn't see, she went along with the prosecutors. Maybe she's not the worst player in this story, but, like, it's just so striking to me. It doesn't say false accuser, you know, famous author is a false accuser of Anthony Broadwater who's finally been released. It's like author Alice Sebold apologize, you know, and it's so interesting.
Black Misandry. But with the titling as well, like, was this a white person who said, who suggested inserting unexpected?
You know, I don't think so. Like, I haven't looked up the entire editorial board at the press, but I think it was, you know, all people, you know, marketing people. I think they were a different array, but I think, you know, like the way they explained it is they felt that just saying the Feminist War on Crime was inflammatory enough, you know, and I do get it. I do get it because for so many years, you know, people writing on feminism and criminal law, and especially like my book was supposed to come out at the height of the Harvey Weinstein trial, Me Too, right? And so here's this book sort of criticizing feminist focus on sexual assault and domestic violence and criminal law as a solution to those things. And so they were expecting it to come out in the middle of, you know, this very, very carceral, very, very sort of feeling good about, you know, tougher criminal laws moment for feminists with Weinstein. And then COVID happened and production was delayed for a year. And the book actually came out right in the midst of the protests about George Floyd's murder and the racism of policing. And so the reception was completely different than what they were anticipating. So they were anticipating the left progressives to just excoriate me for not being pro-women enough. But it came out in a moment where a lot of my critiques about, like, feminist alliance with, you know, actually very racist and sexist police officers was having resonance. So I think they were worried for nothing, but the unintentional, it was so interesting to me because that is how, in the legal writing and in the accountings of how much, you know, women's rights rhetoric and feminism contributed to mass incarceration, it's always kind of like, and I understand a lot of the early activists, you know, and there were women of color also in the carceral activism scene. I mean, nothing is a monolith, but I do think in general, like, women of color feminists, and sort of like socialist feminists, they were very, very, very against this sort of strange bedfellow of police and feminists. But usually the way to look back on it is to say, oh, you know, feminists really wanted to do the right thing. They were in the right place. They just got co-opted, or they just didn't see that it could turn out this way, or they just didn't understand the racism of the system. And, you know, that's true of some of the powerful feminist reformers, but a lot of it's, like, not true, right? They did see the racism in the system, and I know this because, you know, in my research, you see women of color, victims of domestic violence, the ones who are running shelters, telling them that they think a lot of this has to do with white supremacy and the oppression of marginalized men and the communities, and there not being any resources for families that are under stress and just a whole bunch of things. There are literally women of color telling the feminist activists, this is what's going on, and they're actually, you know, faulting the women of color activists for denying the universality of the women's experience, right? So you know, now, like, if you say this is white supremacy, supremacy, women of color, you're just giving your men a pass. That's literally what they were saying. You're just giving your men a pass. And maybe you should look inward and just recognize the racism in this particular exchange. I'm remembering it was a Latina. Why don't you recognize recognize the sexism and the misogyny in Latino culture? And that was literally white feminists' answer at the time to black feminists and feminists of color. They literally were like, be quiet, because we're trying to get a national platform here. And if you blame other things than men, like, than men being just bad and these cultures being like bad, we're not going to get it. So that's intentional. That is intentional. The example I wanted to use was the most famous anti-rape book that came out in 1976 was Susan Brown Miller's Against Our Will. And it was the book that finally was like, rape throughout time has been a tool of male oppression, and it kind of led to this idea of taking rape seriously, which is a good thing. You need to take rape seriously. But interestingly, she spends a not insignificant amount of time kind of justifying the killing of Emmett Till. And you're like, what is going on here? So, she was talking about the fact that, yes, what happened to Emmett Till is terrible, but let's think a little bit more about this whistle, right? And so we now know that the whistle didn't occur, but, back then, that was a story. Let's think a little bit more about this whistle from this black teen to this white woman. This whistle, this is what Susan Brown Miller said, was no just little, hubba hubba, small tweet of a hubba hubba. It was no just little thing. This was a black man telling a white woman, I can have you, right?
Child.
So this whistle, child, exactly, but that's not how she put it, right? That's not how she put it, right? Like, so this whistle, was a big deal precisely because Emmett Till was black and the woman, I forget her name, was white. And when you go back and read that, it just blows your mind. And she draws a direct line between this, hyperbole from Eldridge Cleaver about raping a white woman being an insurrectionary act. And she's like, you see? So whenever a black man says or does anything sexual and, there's a white woman nearby, that's really a heightened danger situation, precisely because black men are using sexuality as a weapon to sort of vindicate their racial equality to whites. And this was a feminist, a very famous, the feminist analysis of the time. And it was just plainly racist.
Intentionally so. Unfortunately, this comes up over and over and over throughout the history of white feminism, white supremacy, racism. I'm skipping ahead a little bit in the text to kind of see some of these same ideas resurface. So this is in your chapter, The Battle Plan. So this is specifically on page 91. You write, from 30,000 feet, all tough on crime measures from the last 3 decades look as if they worked because they coincided with the great crime decline. Most experts, however, agree that incarceration accounted for little, if any, of the decline. Of note, arrests for violent crimes predictably decreased along with the decline in crime rates, although changes in sentencing kept incarceration rates sky high. Domestic violence crime rates similarly decreased, but owing to feminist reform, domestic violence arrests did not. Today, the studies attempting to substantiate the benefits of carceral domestic violence policies and finally answer whether they deter, satisfy victims, and reduce harm crowd Google Scholar. In the meantime, domestic violence defendants crowd the prisons, males and females. The feminists' arrest and punch arguments took on a troublingly racialized tone in response to Sherman's Milwaukee findings that DV arrests escalated violence in black communities. Sherman calculated that across the board, arrest policies reduced violence against white women at the cost of increasing violence against twice as many black women. Instead of rethinking mandatory arrest, some feminists responded with a claim disturbingly reminiscent of the famous Moynihan Report, retired firefighter in Florida. There you go. On the pathology of black subculture discussed in the previous chapter. Joan Zorza, staff attorney at the National Center on Women and Family Law, responded to Sherman in 1992, stating that the first and most important argument against the Milwaukee study was that the subculture of poor black men, society's failures, made them immune to all but the harshest sanctions. She, in quotes, that a few hours under arrest fails to deter the abusers, who are generally considered to be society's failures, is hardly surprising. In some subcultures of ghettoized people, where imprisonment is all too common, a few hours in jail may be seen as only a minor irritation, or even a rite of passage. We do not consider eliminating arrest for other crimes, however, because it may not deter a particular individual or class of individuals. The studies may suggest that to deter more batterers, the stakes may need to be, she just said it, sky high, not lower or non-existent. I will stop there. This is on page 92. Professor Gruber, anything to add? Not, what did they say? Unexpected.
Yeah. So, right, like a quote, like, and let me tell you, like, Joan Zorza was a big deal in domestic violence reform. Champion of women, celebrated feminist. And, you know, here she is basically saying, in the face of systematic study, that mandatory arrest increases violence in the black neighborhood. Like, it increases violence, and there are various theories as to why, but it has to do a lot with economic marginalization and just the effects of jail, and just there are many theories as to why, right? But here is incontrovertible evidence that for women of color, for black women who experience violence, arresting the man increases the chance that they're going to be subject to future violence, right? And and here's what the feminist is saying the reason is. Now, with zero studying, without apparently reading the studies on, you know, what the causal explanations might be, and there are a lot of sociological and ecological reasons why an arrest might be a very violence-provoking thing to one person but not another person. You know, it just depends on a bunch of factors. But she decided on the one factor. And the one factor is that black men in the ghetto are so used to punishment that they don't feel any, right? And I mean, you can trace this right back to the times of enslavement, where this idea that persists and causes all kinds of problems, not only in criminal law, but also in the health arena, basically that black bodies don't feel pain. And so, you know, I had to quote that at length because, again, you know, if I just said, like, look, I mean, the evidence was there in front of the thing. These are feminists making an argument. Nobody would believe me. They'd say, no, you're just saying that. You just want to cast aspersions on feminists. And I wanted to make sure that I didn't. That I was like, look, this is based on what was said at the time, what was known and said. So, you know, every day there's a young feminist come to me and says, okay, I've learned about X crime that I think is a gender crime, and here's my, you know, 4-part solution that involves a lot more policing and imprisonment and punishment. You know, and I say to them, well, you know, that's kind of like weird that you would want that for our future, you know, as feminists, because we have racialized mass incarceration. And, and that kind of thinking kind of led us here. And I always get the students saying, no. Feminists aren't responsible for mass incarceration. It's not that it was a tough on crime politician, or it was Reagan, or it was everybody else. It was Craig, it was Clinton, right? And so I have to bring forward these debates because, frankly, this idea of having to arrest people for domestic violence really did pave the way of sort of thinking like declining, like a police officer declining to arrest somebody was them shirking their duty. I mean, they declined to arrest for all types of things and still do. But this really did say, like if there's violence, police have to arrest. And they did in all kinds of assaults, including assaults committed by women. And now, there was a 30% rise in women in prison due mainly to the reconceiving of violence as something that's always horrible, something you always have to arrest for, including when women perpetrate it. So I have to quote at length because people don't believe me when I say this happened.
Context of White Supremacy. She walked me right to my quote. This is important. This is like a twofer here. So on one portion, this is exactly what she talked about in terms of, no. You don't just dump this on Ronald Reagan and Joe Biden and the crime bill and crack and all that. No. White women bear a nice chunk of this responsibility, even before all of this, but also with regards to the victim. Anthony Broadwater. When we read Lucky, the not naming of Anthony Broadwater throughout the book, number one, she gives him a pseudonym as Gregory Madison, but throughout the book, he's not named. It's just the rapist. All throughout the book, no name, nothing, total dehumanization. So when I got to page 100, that's Alice Sebold, Lucky, and Alice Sebold's Lucky sold 1 million copies, was almost made into a movie. We would have been watching that this year, perhaps. Black male rapist for a crime that I suspect, man, I have doubts just reading her book. But anyway, so this is on page 100, next chapter, The Weapon. Professor Alice Gruber, she writes, the victim image driving the war on crime was very specific. It actively excluded the marginalized men and women, often defendants themselves, who disproportionately suffered from crime but viewed the criminal system with a jaundiced eye. Victims instead were innocent women and children, preferably white, who were subjected to men's unspeakable brutality, preferably sexual. Victims were devastated, angry, and vengeful, and they defined themselves by that one bad moment in life. Victims felt oppressed by insufficiently zealous prosecutors, prying defense attorneys, due process protections, and lenient judges. Victims desired and benefited from greater participation in the criminal process and were satisfied with the sole reward of the perpetrator's incarceration. Victims also took on an almost deific quality, making the war on crime something of a holy war. The veneration of victims, Minnow writes, reflects an almost religious view of suffering, empowering those who suffer with reverence from others. Bill Clinton's Attorney General, Janet Reno, in a speech supporting the Federal Victims' Rights Amendment, called victims but little lower than angels. Decades later, candidate Donald Trump picked up on this theme and featured angel moms, the mothers of children killed by immigrants, at his rallies. I keep saying Alice Sebold just so that you all can hear a little bit of why I keep saying. This is just one paragraph. She writes in Lucky, that day it all got raw. if she calls him Gregory Madison, this is Anthony Broadwater, if Madison stood next to his friend and played a game of eyes to psych me out, then I would give it right back to him. I was authentic. I had been a virgin. Virgin, 46 times the word virgin in this book. He had broken my hymen in 2 places. The OBGYN, J. Marion Sims, father of gynecology, would testify to the fact. I was also a good girl, that phrase in the book 9 times, and I knew how to dress and what to say to accentuate that. That night following the grand jury testimony, I called Madison a motherfucker in the privacy of my dorm room while I pounded my pillow and bed with my fists. I swore the kind of bloodthirsty revenge no one thought possible coming from a 19-year-old co-ed. While still in court, I thanked the jury. I drew on my resources, placating, making my family smile. As I left the courtroom, I felt I had put on the best show of my life. I'll stop there. I was going to read the poem where she talks about castrating him and chopping off his balls and slicing out his eyes and all that, but this is a lot shorter and much more to the point about the deific victims and the crime bill. Do you have thoughts you'd like to share, Professor Gruber?
Yeah, and I haven't read Lucky, but reading that, I mean, there's a way to read that where, it's almost like an admission kind of wrapped up in a kind of woe is me story. So the admission that's wrapped up in it is that victimhood is completely constructed. It's a performance. It's a placeholder. It's a placeholder for so many things, for racial anxiety, for, vindicating your worth, for understanding women. So I think, one of the points she could have been making is why should I have to be a virgin? I had to perform virginity, right? But it's ironic because the whole victims' rights movement and the whole idea of, sort of communing with victims is constructed from the outset. So it could include virgin or it cannot include virgin, but it still has parameters. And throughout our American history, these parameters have been that certain people aren't eligible for victimhood, right? So when you think about rape, by law or lack of law, during enslavement, black women couldn't be victims, right? That was just part of life for them, rape. And then that sort of inability to be a victim gets inscribed onto black women. And then, in terms of people who are the perpetrators, it's still much easier, even though that has opened up a little with Me Too, it's still much easier for people to see, men of color, or people that look deviant or are poor, as rapists or as offenders, to bring stereotypes into who they see as domestic violence offenders and who they see as good guys. So all of this is going on. And, in one way, she's kind of critiquing it. She's just saying, this is just a performance. But then you're participating in a performance that is driving policy and driving law and driving mass incarceration. So I just think, it's been for many years, and there's many, many causal explanations, but really sort of hitting its stride in the 60s, where this idea of what crime is not it's a pathology or it's a disease or anything. Those were kind of in for a while, in the 20s. But it became dividing the world into good and evil, right? And the evil people were monsters and the good people were saints. And so once you do this, you have no problem then, having these high sentences, watering down due process and all of that. Because people buy the rhetoric, right? That certain people are evil and certain people are good. But this rhetoric always overlaps with programs of oppression, with management of people, with management of areas of cities, with where police want to be, who wants the money, right? So from the outset, the logic only works, right, if there's some objective person out there designating who's the evildoer and who's the good. But there's not, right? This has always been managed by pre-existing notions of who isn't or isn't evil. So like, for example, who is or isn't a rapist. Studies confirm it. History shows it. But the person of black men is constructed throughout history and both intentionally and unintentionally by white women and others as sexually dangerous. And so, this idea that they're just neutral notions, even of like sexual danger and all this, it's not true. This has always been a constructed world. And to sort of like triple down on these notions of like good and bad and evil and wrongdoing, I mean, like, they water down due process, so you end up convicting innocents. But even if the person isn't innocent, that rhetoric isn't only in horrible, brutal rapes. That rhetoric is everywhere. Like, oh, I can't believe this person pickpocketed from me. They must be evil, right? So that rhetoric of dividing the world, and it just so happens that evil overlaps with race. Like that's just a coincidence? No, it's not a coincidence. Because this whole way of thinking about criminal law was a product of the era of integration and fears of quote-unquote urban black crime.
Context of white supremacy. I will get in one more segment from the text, and then I'll nab some of the folks who dialed in with questions for Professor Aya Gruber. This is on page 107 of the text. She writes it directly to some of the commentary that she just gave us about who, and I mean, hey, white people cannot be ignorant about white supremacy, racism. I've said that for almost the full 13 years that we've been on the air. Like, if you're classified as white anywhere in the known universe, you already know, like, they don't do no-knock raids in white areas. They don't come harass and do broken windows policies where we do minor nuisance arrests where white people live. We already know where that's going. We already know who the targets are going to be. Even the children know that. So, I mean, hey, this is, again, unexpected. But page 107, you write, reformers also justified the direct and indirect harm to prosecution-averse women by the rationale that domestic violence is a crime against society, channeling Reagan's deft recharacterization of poor street criminals as a privileged class. Battered women's advocates branded the rhetoric of slavery, branded individual, often marginalized men's violence as the oppressive force in society, with battering established as a patriarchal force. In legal scholar Claire Houston's words, feminists argued that, regardless of the victim's wishes, allowing DV to continue against an individual woman reinforces male control over women as a class. In turn, determining DV criminal policy was not a matter of weighing prosecution-resistant victims' interests against pro-law enforcement victims' interests. It was a matter of weighing prosecution-resistant victims' interests against the well-being of all women. In this view, the victim who refused to cooperate was an ally of male supremacy, an accomplice to her own battering, as feminist psychologist Lenore Walker remarked. Police and prosecutors' growing practice of overriding and even mistreating non-cooperative victims was particularly perilous, I would add another P, predictable for poor women of color. To be sure, there are many reasons why white middle-class women avoid prosecution and separation outside of direct coercion. Nevertheless, poor women of color face greater constraints that keep them tethered to violent men and are at greater risk of harm from law enforcement. And, in an ironic twist, middle-class white women are more able to opt out of the carceral system that was created to fit their every woman needs. Studies confirm that women with income have greater access to resources to assist them in keeping their abuse private. They have the ability to afford private physicians and safe shelters, which results in their being able to escape detection from law enforcement. This is in contrast to the socioeconomically distressed victims who call the police for aid, only to find that their aid has been defined as arrest for decades. Legal scholar Donna Coker remarks, "It is a cruel trap when the state's legal interventions rest on the presumption that women who are serious about ending domestic violence will leave their partner while at the same time reducing dramatically the availability of public assistance that makes leaving somewhat possible." I will stop there. I just don't see a whole lot of concern amongst so-called white women feminists for black males, black females, anybody. All of this pretty much seems geared towards them and ensuring that a lot of black people are, males and females, a lot of black people are going to be encaged. Am I incorrect?
I don't think that's incorrect. I mean, when you look back, you know, I've had occasion in writing the book and in this current project that I'm writing on to look back, you know, again at a lot of these writings in the 70s and 80s. And you know, and I think, you know, they haven't aged well. Let's put it that way. So when young feminist scholars are looking back at them, they're like, God, you know, why did these amazing feminists have this racial blind spot? Why did they this and that? And it strikes me that it wasn't a blind spot so much as their whole theory of what was going on in the world would be completely upended if they were to admit that, you know, a lot of the policies that they were championing and the phenomena that they were describing were based on like stereotypical notions of people of color and had nothing to do with, you know, the lived experience of the women who they claim to be speaking on behalf of, right? And I just don't think they could admit it, because where a lot of these feminists came from was trying to assert their subordination, right? And women are subordinated relative to men in many areas, right? But as, you know, like Kimberly Crenshaw said, all of this is intersectional, and I would add also it's contextual. Like, you know, both women and men can be oppressed by patriarchy, and, you know, some women are going to get a benefit from patriarchy sometimes, right? Like, so one benefit women get in patriarchy is, for example, in custody battles, women get a benefit from the idea of women as natural mothers and, you know, better parents. So that's kind of like a benign form of sex discrimination. So anyway, I think like these women, the feminists were, you know, the white feminists of the time were saying, you know, we're just looking at the world from our perspective of oppressed women and not from all the interrelated, intersectional ways that people can feel oppression, including white supremacy. So for them, like, they had to be at the very least willfully blind to it, because, like, again, there were quite literally feminists of color and other groups coming up and saying, this is not what we want. And what I found was that a theme in that kind of work, in that very carceral feminist work, is, you know, is almost like goading women into recognizing not only that they're victims and that, you know, whatever sort of feminist concern, you know, like crime that sparked feminist concern is the most important thing in their life, like more important than their family, more important than their kids, more important than their economic security. It's that he's, you know, abusive, right? And for some women it is, but they really wanted to be in a situation of convincing women that, okay, first of all, you've got to elevate this to the most important thing in your life. And then second of all, you have to cooperate with state power. Because if you don't cooperate with state power, you're like the, feminist psychologist said, you're an accomplice to your own victimhood, right? Like, and every other woman's in the country and in the world. And you see this theme sort of playing out a little bit in Me Too also. So the idea is if you don't recognize like a range of sexual behaviors as wrong, as not just wrong, but horrible wrongs and rapes, and report it or out it or cancel it or like bring it to the light. If you keep any of that as something that happened to you, and maybe it's not good, but maybe something you can work out or work out with that. If you do any of that stuff and don't immediately go to the police, you're the one who's enabling rapists. Like telling women that their victimhood makes them responsible to be an agent of the state. And that's the part that I'm really like, wow, that doesn't even seem very feminist to me. Telling female victims that they're no good unless they go along with the program that you've engineered.
Paternalism is very common in the system of white supremacy. Talking down to black people seems to never go out of style, even when talking about what's best for them.
Wouldn't you think that feminists wouldn't want to be like that? That feminists wouldn't want to be paternalists?
It's been my experience that individuals classified as white, male, male, female, and children. We had a white man on the program 2 weeks ago. He wrote a report saying that he was a bigot at 4 and was going to talk down to his black caretaker who was in her 40s and had children of her own who were much older than him. He went to go talk down to her and practice racism and all the rest. I mean, hey, what does it mean to be white? Apparently, talking down to black people is a core component. Men, women, children, they all got that one. Let's see. We'll nab a caller or two. Folks have a question for a professor of law at the University of Colorado Law School, Professor Aya Gruber. Let's see. The number, 720-716-7300. The code 564-943#. Press star 61 if you would like to participate. Our caller 2262. If you had a question for Professor Gruber, you should be with us.
May I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Yes, thank you for taking my call, Gus, and greetings to everyone on the line. My question is from Ms. Gruber. Ms. Gruber, I'm a non-white black male. I've been horribly victimized my entire life, so I get confused easily. My question is, when you were asked if you were white or non-white, what was your answer to that?
My answer was, it depends on who you ask.
I have another question, if I could. Ms. Gruber, when you're around white people, do they see you as white or non-white?
That's a really, really interesting question because it's very contextual, and I've both been treated as a person of color for instrumental reasons by white people and denied status as a person of color for instrumental reasons by white people, and I'll explain. So when, say I'm in a group and somebody needs to say, oh, we have a woman of color in the group, right, for their diversity purposes, then I can be a woman of color, right? But when I assert, for example, if I'm talking about hiring or admissions, we need to hire people of color, they're just well, we don't have to listen to you. So it's very interesting. It's just, being a person who presents racially ambiguous, most people, if you ask them, would probably say that just by looking at me, I look Latina. But in fact, I'm, half Asian. I've been sort of like my own identity, even though I identify as a person of color and somewhat as Asian, but, you know, like more light-skinned Asians and people who are 100% Asians, like I felt some colorism there too, which is interesting. But again, like I have found that my race to other people often depends on how they would like to manipulate that to the benefit of what they're trying to achieve. And I think as Gus was saying, like a lot of the times what, you know, a lot of my white interlocutors are trying to achieve is white supremacy. So I've like totally seen that happen, but I don't, you know, again, I don't claim to be in a place of lived experience, you know, to speak for, you know, the people who have been terrorized by like the state or have grown up like very vulnerable to state violence, because I don't even think, you know, if I was 100% Asian, that an Asian woman or a white woman is vulnerable to state violence. So I hate to be complex about the answer. Like I identify as a woman of color. You know, my mother was disowned when she married my father. There's, you know, I've got a history of, you know, my mother being detained on the basis of her race, and I've got a history of like racism in my family and stuff. But but then again, I understand the complexities and the ambiguities and the lines, so I don't, you know, purport to speak for, you know, women of color necessarily, given that I am biracial. But it's very interesting. Like it's very complicated to trace the times when people treat me as a person of color and when they don't, because they're almost invariably political and about trying to, like they don't like something I'm saying or they do like something I'm saying. It's trying to like situate their own point of view.
Thank you for your response, Mr. Gruber. And thank you guys for taking my call. And I'll mute my line.
Much obliged, good sir. Before we nab Thomas in New York, Professor Gruber, you said racism in your own family. What does that mean? Can you give us details?
Yeah, I mean, so, you know, this is a story that, you know, I've been told because my grandfather on my dad's side, who was like white and Jewish, died before I was like 1, so I never met him. But he basically, when my dad said he was marrying my mom, kind of like slammed down his fist on the table and said, "You're no son of mine," and walked out and, you know, was out of his life, basically. And, you know, it's interesting because my mom, when my sister was born, she's older than me, wrote him a letter that said, you know, you can, which I'm like, Mom, I wouldn't have done that. But she was basically like, you could hate me, you know, but please, for the sake of your son who loves you, don't be estranged from your son. And for the sake of your grandchildren, let them have a grandfather. So she actually wrote him, you know, like a letter. And I don't know what happened because he died pretty soon afterwards, but I heard like in his office, he had a safe and they found all, you know, his important whatever he put in the safe. And one of the things they found in that safe was that letter. That's the way the story goes. But, yeah. So, I mean, you know, and it's weird being, biracial in a family that maybe like the white side of the family doesn't so much accept the of color side, right? That's an interesting place to be. It's also interesting to be somebody who works on race in a world where Asianness is thought of as sort of foreignness, like being a recent Asian immigrant, and all that comes along with that, because my mother's family was here for many, many, many years, and they had owned land in what's now Silicon Valley. But when the U.S. government during World War II came and put all the Japanese citizens in Japanese American citizens of Japanese descent. So these were American citizens. When they swept them up and put them all in the camps, they also took their land. So I don't know. It's just interesting because we have ideas that, maybe Asians share similar experiences, and to some extent you do. But within, racial groups, there's a lot of variability and there's a lot of difference. So it's just been an interesting thing to be somebody who writes on race and researches race and the criminal justice system. But I don't really do a lot of writing and researching about my own race because, the criminal justice system is something that is so very much in this country a legacy of enslavement, a legacy, like a post-colonial legacy, and also something that has to do a lot with changing demographic patterns in the United States, like how many Latinos have arrived. So it's just a very interesting place being sort of a biracial Asian who writes about issues that have to do with race, but not necessarily my own race.
Fascinating. Much obliged for the detail, Professor Gruber. Thomas in New York, did you have a question for Professor Gruber? You should be with us, sir.
Yes, Gus, thank you. I had a few questions. What did you self-identify as when your state ID, your driver's license, job application, census form, did you identify as a white or Asian?
I generally identify as an Asian if they only let me check one box. If they let me check two boxes, I check both boxes. That's generally what I do. When I was in school, they used to call me China, which actually, I went to school in Miami, which actually means an Asian-looking Latina. So that was weird.
Oh, okay. How did you notice a difference when you interacted with mixed race Japanese and white people in your peer groups that had a white mother instead of a Japanese mother? Did they have a different mentality or mindset?
That's really interesting. I have a sense that, and this is just a very gendered sense, and I think this, of course, depends on, how you were raised or whatever, but people who were raised by a mother who's a person of color maybe tend more to identify as a person of color, than people whose fathers are black. I could be wrong. I don't know. I don't know if that's true. But, I didn't know. I knew one other half Japanese person growing up. So that, and I knew one other full Japanese, ethnically Japanese person. But when I was growing up, there weren't many Asians. I went to a huge public school, but there weren't a ton of Asians in Miami. So it was not as present for me that I had other people I could compare my experiences to.
Okay. Well, thank you for the answer. Now, amongst black people, we have a serious feminism problem, and some even call themselves womanists. Now, black males have absolutely no power. We live in a system of white supremacy, as you agreed to earlier, which happens to be a white patriarchal system. Does black women being feminists even make logical sense in your opinion?
Well, there have been quote-unquote black feminists from the very beginning, and I mean the very beginning. Even if you look back, and you see Ida B. Wells, she was a feminist, right? I mean, she was one of the most vocal women on behalf of rights at the time, but she was totally against the mainstream white feminist movement back in, the late 1800s to raise the age of consent, to whip up people with anti-rape sentiments, which would lead to lynching. But she was a feminist and kind of known so at her time. So from the beginning, there have been black feminists, there have been feminists of color, but their brand of feminism just look really different. And I think, unsurprisingly, I don't think this should be a surprise, although it is to many people, that A, there was even any other voice in feminism that, but B, these kind of voices didn't gain traction because feminism operated in tandem with the social phenomena at the time, like enslavement and Jim Crow. So, why is it we think that for, feminists, like the crimes, it's never like, the boss who is, keeping the wages of marginalized women of color who are working to the bone, or them being gouged on the rent or anything like that. Those are never the crimes that feminists care about. All those crimes against women that aren't like rape and domestic violence. Well, rape and domestic violence in the late 1800s were constructed by legislatures in the South as quote unquote Negro crimes. And one of the things that they would do is they tried to create their voter disenfranchisement laws to make sure that the Negro crimes led to the men not being able to vote, because the women couldn't vote yet anyway. And so interestingly, I think it was in Mississippi, like one of the proposals was that you would have all forms of domestic violence and sex crimes be crimes that rendered you ineligible to vote, but murder wouldn't be, because they knew that like white men were killing a lot of people. So from the very outset, like these crimes, quote unquote, crimes against women, they're not the only thing that people can do bad to women, but they became the poster children for feminism, and they were sort of singled out by segregationists in the South. So it's very interesting that, a lot of feminists don't know this history. And I got to tell you, there are tons of women of color who are also feminists who take a kind of carceral approach to feminism, because that's just always been the way it is with feminism. So I do think that there, are women of color, including black women, who do sort of support the mainstream feminist view. But I also think there have been throughout history schools of different kind of feminism that weren't like that, right? That were way more about looking at what a lot of, for example, black men and women have in common that is oppressing them, like, for example, white supremacy, or what poor men and women have in common, and that would be like an unfair system that doesn't have social safety nets, or that where the rich keep all the money. Like, there were a lot of schools of feminism that wanted to look towards that, but they just never got traction, like the sort of put the men in jail school. And by men, it really was black men. So, yeah, that's how it happened.
Okay, thank you. My last question, thank you, Gus. How can I'll switch that. How can men counter feminism? Because it's taken away it's made a lot of things unequal, I think. How can men counter it, do you think? Because you'll get ridiculed, you'll get demonized for saying something. So what's an effective way of countering it? I'll mute my line. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's really hard, right? Because if you're a man and you say some of the things I've said about feminists, right, and the history of feminism, you'll just be called a sexist. And they'll be like, well, of course you think that, right? Like, more proof that. But I think one of the things is it's very careful to do is say, like, look, I believe in equality, and I believe that nobody should be subjected to violence and there shouldn't be rape and all this. Of course I believe it. But what has happened is a system in which feminists have been complicit with all the things that people are out protesting, right? Like police violence, like the prison system, like maintaining poverty, maintaining segregation. And feminists should be against that, right? I mean, you don't have to say like all feminists are like this, because again, there are many schools of feminism, and not all of them were that, sort of lock them up and throw away the key brand. But I think it is fair to point out that that brand somehow became the mainstay, and that it's really has bolstered and intersected with a lot of things that I think if you're talking to like liberal progressive women, they don't like. And that includes like mass incarceration, segregation, poverty, so many things that, this brand of white or carceral feminism or whatever you want to call it, this brand of really punitive feminism has bolstered all these bad things, so that's what I would do. I mean, I agree that I think, again, this is one area where being a woman will give you some privilege. It's that you can, but still, you can't imagine the things that have been said to me about my writing and stuff too. I've been told to my face that women die because of me. So it is, I think it's hard to do this work where you're challenging things that people think are just so natural, right? But people thinking just like putting people in jail was natural is how we got here, is how we got to this situation in our country of mass incarceration. So I wish you luck. That's what I can say.
She said, I wish you lucky once again. Before we nab Kwaku, I guess he dialed in on the Skype line, just two quick things. One, Ian Hani Lopez was a guest on the program way back when, 13 years. He's also a law professor, but he wrote the book White by Law, which does relate a little bit to the program since we've been talking about racial classification and non-white people and all that. But he said one of the things with these racial classifications in white supremacy is that when you make things law, like about punishment, we got to be very carceral. It makes things seem almost ordained by God, which can make it very difficult to change things. I thought that was really important and pertinent to our dialogue today. Also, man, when they tell you, Professor Gruber, women die because of you, now you can be accepted as white sometimes. When they look at Anthony Broadwater, myself, when they say women die because of you, they mean something very different. Same sentence. Kwaku?
Yep.
Did you have a question for Professor Aya Gruber? You should be with us. Kwaku, are you there? Just listening? Or if you're talking, maybe you're muted or...
now?
Oh, think we got you that time. Try it again.
Okay. As I was saying, greetings to the guests, Gus, and the callers. My first question is, who is more confused about racism, white supremacy, white people or non-white people?
I don't think white people are confused. I think they're in deliberate denial. Now, of course, I can't say like all white people, but like the general construct of white person is, I don't think there's any confusion there. I don't think, so for example, it's interesting to me because with these, and again, this kind of like dovetails with feminism, and I think, Gus, we had talked about this over the email with the parents and the mothers mainly showing up to shut down the teaching of history, of real history of this country in schools. I don't think, there's a lot of like the counter to that, like, oh, they just don't understand what critical race theory is and isn't. And if they only knew more, right? Like, no, I think it's precisely because they understand what it is that they're trying to shut it down. So I wouldn't use the word confusion.
Okay, thank you. My next question is, who's the intended audience of your book, and what was your goal for writing the book?
Oh, that's a really good question. So, interestingly, the last caller was like, well, situating myself as a black man, how do I try to fight this without, not just being run out of town, but having the cops called on me or something like that. And I think that's a really, really good question, because I was hoping to talk to young feminists thinking of becoming activists and lawyers in the space of criminal law who have in their mind, okay, I'm going to make the next mandatory minimum for rape. I'm going to make the next, funding that goes to the police department to be, the like women's unit, or like I'm going to look at the New York City Police Department and see how misogynistic they are against people who complain about rape, and I'm just going to give them even more money, right? Like, so my intended audience is, if you're coming up with that sort of feminist set of beliefs that I had ingrained in me, here's another way of looking at the world. And maybe before you go down that road of being just another stream of income and power to race, to what I think of as a very racist arm of the state, not, there are other ones too, but like very particular. Like, before you go that way, think about it and maybe see how that goes. So it was really kind of intended for young feminists, and they don't have to be women, but young people who are very interested in what it means to be a feminist. So yeah, that's kind of who I was hoping to convince, were people who might not agree with me, at the outset.
Okay, thank you. And this, just kind of following up on the last caller's question, just for some more clarity, can you provide some specific phrases or, sayings or quotes that reveal truth about, the system of racism, white supremacy, or so-called feminism? I identify as a victim of racism. So oftentimes when I speak about feminism, I can, it's kind of received negatively. So do you have some specific phrases or recommendations?
Yeah, I don't know what the specific phrases are, but one thing I do notice that works, and it's kind of maybe just a function of the world we live in, where I think personal identity is doing a lot of work these days in terms of arguments. So this is one of the areas where I was saying earlier that I'm de-raced or e-raced, is when I'm kind of, talking about the racism of the feminist system. I'll get a white woman say, oh, well, it's, easy for you to say, but what about all the black women who are going to suffer because, we're not putting enough, men in jail, right? So it's kind of if you're speaking from a place of race and you are a person of color, I think that white feminists feel less emboldened to, go full force with the, oh, you're horrible, and things like that. Which is why I think a lot of the time I'm being called a white woman, despite self-identifying as a person of color, is by other white women who don't want to hear the critique, right? So one of the things I've noticed is, if you could say feminists in the 70s, some of the famous feminist anti-rape activists, were kind of justifying the murder of Emmett Till. That's kind of a big one, That's where some of the thought came from. That, instead of looking at the history of, lynching and racial terrorism of black men in the South, what they took from that is not okay, we've got to not repeat these patterns, but somehow that made black men more sexually dangerous because they're going to want to conquer white women now, that was one of the things that mainstream feminists said. That same feminist in the same book said of the Scottsboro boys case that, and this is almost a direct quote, I kind of have it memorized, that at the time, the famous Scottsboro case where Ruby Bates and Victoria Price were like sort of hoboing on a train. This was back in, 30s, 40s, hoboing on a train, and they fabricated a gang rape, and, many years later, posthumously, the Scottsboro boys were exonerated. But anyway, like what she says of that infamous case is that, well, the progressives of the time were really into civil rights, and they needed their heroes. And so they made heroes out of a bunch of semi-literate miscreants and vilified two white women in the process. So that's what you say to the Scottsboro boys, that it was that this case was about vilifying white women and not about the fact that, men were put in jail for their entire lives for a crime they didn't commit and almost lynched, right? Subject to a lynch mob.
Children, second time this program, children.
Exactly, right? And it'll never, and that's another thing too that the race part does. Like feminists would be much more like when they talk about juvenile justice. Oh, I don't believe that like children should go to jail. No, I'm not for that. But like when you look at a lot of these rape crimes and different crimes, especially sex crimes, they are in fact committed by children, or children are accused, but the children, and especially if they're boys of color, they don't get to have child status. Their race makes them ineligible to be children. So, I mean, I don't know what soundbite I could use, but I would say that, in defense of this idea of taking crimes against women seriously, white feminists had in mind white women and what white women would want, right? And they didn't listen. A lot of them didn't listen to black feminists. And a lot of them also said really racist things, in sort of defending their programs. Like, for example, rationalizing Emmett Till's murder. I mean, I don't think you could get worse than that, honestly.
Okay. Thank you. Just my last question, and thank you again. So my last question, and a yes or no would be fine for this one. So in regards to eliminating the system of racism, white supremacy, and producing a system of justice, is it constructive for people classified as black to participate in feminism? And I'll go ahead and mute my line after that.
Yes. But I think there's ways to participate. There's changing, tearing down, changing its meaning. I just don't understand. We still have a situation where single mother women of color are disproportionately homeless and dying and poor, right? Like there's so many converging interests that feminists should have with those seeking to topple white supremacy, that it's just, it's just amazing. Like there's so many things to fight against right now. And we're in a moment when, there are a lot of white liberals who are completely activated as anti-racist now because of Trump. But yet, when it comes to crimes against women in criminal law, it's just like there's such a holdout there. And I think only by women of color, men of color, and there being diverse voices within that movement that, that kind of energy, because there's tons of energy behind things like Me Too, right, behind feminist movements, that kind of energy can be directed in ways that don't end up further entrenching racism. So my short answer is yes, but it's not easy.
Much obliged, Kwaku. Dread138, he was actually going to help us do the narration for Alice Sebold's Lucky, but then we got the audiobook and got to hear her read her own memoir, which was 1,000 times better. Before I nab Dread138, this is just from page 166 of The Feminist War on Crime, The Unexpected Role of Women's Liberation in Mass Incarceration, from 166. And I said this, I was so excited because when I contacted Professor Gruber about being on the program, I connected this. White people are not ignorant, they're not unaware, not unexpected, and I connected this all the way back. I said, hey, when we talk about the school-to-prison pipeline, white women are at the center. And she said, well, that's not really the focus of my research. And I said, oh, yeah, no problem, all that. But when I got to 166, she had the one paragraph in the middle that says, one is left to wonder why progressive campus activists assume that a rights-denying campus disciplinary system would be wholly different from the racist criminal system they regularly protested. College administrators, make sure I get that. College administrators tend to avoid tangling with rich, powerful parents, conferring an undeniable advantage on the more privileged party in a sexual assault dispute. It is well known that primary and secondary school discipline has long been applied disproportionately to marginalized African American children, especially boys. Black male privilege. Department of Education data on national primary and secondary education shows that black boys constituted 25% of suspended students and black girls 14% in the 2015 to 2016 academic year, even though each group made up about 8% of the student population, both overrepresented. But wow, being a black boy. Moreover, black students were a third of the students referred to police, although they constituted 15% of the student population. Dread138, did you have a question for Professor Gruber?
Yes, good evening, Gus. Good evening, Professor Gruber. Good evening, callers and listeners. Professor Gruber, I'm curious if you would be willing, if you have shared already, that's fine, if you would be willing to share or contrast and compare high-profile sex crime cases such as Bill Cosby to Harvey Weinstein. And I have the second question. Given what you've been saying and so far what I've caught, do you think some white feminists value whiteness over the feminist identity? I'm in my line. Thank you.
Yeah, so just three things. Thank you so much for that question. They're both great questions. But the first thing on the school thing, the only thing, I mean, the statistics are indisputable that the school disciplinary system is so disproportionately brought to bear against children of color and particularly black boys. That's just like, you're not going to find any statistics otherwise. And, having like school safety officers like raises that. What I couldn't say was like, who's doing the reporting? Because the frank, matter is like, when you look at things like racial profiling amongst the police, it's like done by a lot of black police officers also, right? So it's not always just white people doing it, but it is always generally black men and boys who are getting the brunt of it, and so it can get complicated like that, but there is no doubt that the system, whoever's triggering it, and I do believe it might be disproportionately white women. I just don't know, right? But that definitely who's on the receiving end of the burden in this case are students of color in general and black boys, like even more in particular. So as to your two questions, like, it's very interesting to me about both of those high profile cases sparking this Me Too revolution, because, I think it kind of like, for young feminists, painted a false picture of how policing, prosecution, and imprisonment really work. So they were thinking of these, disempowered sort of victims and very, very, very powerful men who seem to just get away with it over and over and over and over and over and over again. And so then there's an outcry. And then, you know, in both Weinstein and Cosby's cases, there were unprecedented uses of evidence there that, you know, I'm not going to get into the weeds with it, but, you know, from my defense attorney perspective, it really was giving a lot of benefit to the prosecutor that the law says you can't give, like letting them parade witnesses in uncharged conduct, like one after the other, like you're not supposed to do that. And that was all in service of the idea that these men were so powerful and, you know, the victims so disempowered that by using the criminal law and giving prosecutors a lot of leeway, that somehow like balances the scale of powers, and it was really a pro-underdog move. And I just kind of see it a different way. I think the typical recipient of broadened police and prosecution authority are not like these untouchable guys, right? It's, you know, people who are generally policed, people where, like, you know, Gus was reading before, like the women, you know, in neighborhoods where they have no other choice when they need violence interruption at the moment or need some service, but to call the police, right? Like those are the people who will be policed, not just the worst untouchable people. And so when we create these laws that give the state and prosecutors an enormous amount of power because we think it's going to topple like the Trumps of the world, right? That's what women imagine. Trump's next. Trump next for sexual assault. It never works out that way, right? Because, you know, you have to have slipped from your power even a little bit to be vulnerable, which those two had, right? And those at the height of their power still have the power to avoid the broadened criminal law. So the criminal law that's been broadened in the name of toppling these high-profile people, it's just operating out there. And, you know, all the people who weigh in on Me Too in favor of these laws never follow up who's really coming under the purview of it, right? Because once law is passed, once Harvey Weinstein's in jail, we don't have to think about it anymore. So that's kind of to your first question. And wait, what was the second question? There was a second question.
Dread 138.
Yes, I'm here. Sorry, I was muted. The second question was, do you think that some white women value the identity of whiteness or dedication to white supremacy over their identity as feminists?
I mean, I think that they would say no. You know, we're doing this reform on behalf of black women. That was a very common thing. And also, you know, I have to say that there are women of color who have a carceral view of, you know, of how we should deal with crimes against women or gender violence, who have said, well, you know, your point of view seems to be very good for men of color, for straight men of color, but what about women of color? So there is this, you know, thread that, like, you know, fine, maybe these carceral reforms put black men in jail, but, you know, if they're putting black men in jail, they must be helping black women, right? So that's kind of, I think, what those who are in favor of these policies would say. But I think, and in my book, I lay this out through many, many pages, I think, you know, that claim that this isn't racism at all, in fact, if anything, this is on behalf of women of color, kinds of falls apart on scrutiny. Because, again, it was literally women of color telling a lot of the white feminists, this isn't the answer, right? This is, like, we see this as a multifaceted thing. And quite literally, that Latina shelter feminist saying, white supremacy is the root of domestic violence. Like, that is a quote from her. And what you see then is white women completely insisting on what sociologist Beth Ritchie has called the every woman dialogue, which is like, it doesn't matter where you are on the racial or socioeconomic spectrum, violence, domestic violence equally happens to all people, And to the extent that women of color feel more violence, it's not because of white supremacy. It's basically because their men are a bunch of sexists. I mean, that was kind of their response. So for me, the very fact that you have, the mainstream celebrated feminists of the day who are really the architects of the modern domestic violence movement and modern anti-rape movement kind of saying like, here are women of color and women victims of color telling us their experiences, and we're saying to them, nope, it doesn't matter. That is, to me, their feminism is white supremacy then. It's not like they, their brand of feminism then just becomes all mixed up in white supremacy. And then, when you have, like that quote from Zorza, when you have really good empirical studies showing that this program that helps white middle-class women because, the threat of jail maybe, slaps them out, gives them the wake-up call or whatever, but it's not working for communities of color. And they just say, oh, that's only because men of color don't feel pain. That makes their feminism white supremacy. So I just think that it is not an either or. I think that the very feminism itself got overly complicit with white supremacy. And so you need to change the feminism itself. I don't think they picked white supremacy over feminism. I think they made a brand of feminism that was complicit in white supremacy. That's really even a harder thing to disentangle.
From the black male perspective at time, they can seem one and the same. The caller be in Santa Rosa, Southern California, all the love. Did you have a question for Professor Aya Gruber, be in Santa Rosa?
I tuned in extremely late. I have a couple of questions. My first question is, are you a feminist?
I consider myself a feminist.
Okay. My next question is, when you fill out applications, why don't you put white?
I do. I do when I have, the option to check two, but I don't know. I feel as a biracial person, I don't feel completely white. I feel like I can pass for white, and that, it's interesting how your identity is constructed. I'm, charged with being white when I'm critiquing white feminists. The white feminists will be like, well, you're white, So it's just interesting. But yeah, I guess if I were to self-identify, I would identify as a person of color. But I don't think it's the same as somebody who's biracial black. I think there's a different history, and I would totally understand why, even if given two check boxes, black, right? But I just feel that I want to recognize the difference in lived experience between being somebody who is half white and not, that I can acknowledge that, although I identify as a woman of color.
Okay. My next.
Well, I mean, what do you think about that? I mean, what are your thoughts? If I can put the question back on you.
Well, I'm not white, so I don't know what I put there besides black. So I'm not white at all. But if I was biracial, would I put white? Don't know.
Yeah.
Don't have that experience. So.
Right.
Did I answer your question?
Yeah, no, I was curious, yeah.
All right, my next question. When you use the word people of color, I noticed you used it to, I noticed that when you used it, outside of using that word, you also said black people, or black women, or black boys. So I'm trying to figure out who are people of color, and are we qualified to be people of color?
Yes, so I definitely think black people are people of color, but the reason, so people of color, I'm just using sort of painting as a broad brush, people who I think have racial or ethnic identities that make them vulnerable to white supremacy and to oppression. So Latino, Native American, Indigenous, Asian, and a lot of it's contextual, and of course, Black Americans. The reason I single out Black is because even amongst people of color, I think probably like most of American law and most of American policy, but even especially criminal law and policy, there is a distinctly escalated oppressive effect when it comes to both black men and women.
Double whammy.
Yeah, exactly, Latino counterparts. But the black men are probably the most targeted. Now, that being said, women have been the fastest growing segment of the prison population over the last several years. Like, the police are getting very okay with arresting women, especially women of color. That's Latino women, but disproportionately among women, black women. So it's not only just there being like racism against, people of color writ large. Within the group of people of color subjected to racism, it's particularly pronounced against black people.
Okay. My last question.
Of course, it depends. Okay. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
What did you say?
No, I was just going to make a little caveat that, of course, how a lot of this operates. It depends on where you are. If you're, down towards the border, you're going to get a lot of racism, based on, being Latino. So, some of this is context dependent, but I feel very comfortable saying generally of the criminal justice system, first of all, it is very racist, but second of all, within that, particularly against black people.
Okay. That'll be it.
Corinne, I wanted to make sure before we let you enjoy the rest of your evening, I learned quite a bit in reading the Feminist War on Crime, the unexpected role of women's liberation in mass incarceration. This is on 184. I kind of did a double take. Not that I should have been surprised, but, you write, because of the 1980s predator laws, sexual offense carries serious penalties. The injustice apparently lay in Persky's discretion to sentence below the 14-year maximum of Brock Turner's crimes. Yet the judge and probation department applied discretion in a prototypically progressive way by accounting for factors like age, intoxication, and lack of criminal record that militated against the defendant's culpability and recidivist risk. For Dauber, such factors were illegitimate because campus rapists are all young, they are all intoxicated for the most part, and they're all high-achieving. However, young and intoxicated rape defendants benefiting from youth and intoxication mitigation are no different from juvenile murder defendants benefiting from the ban on juvenile capital punishment. Recognizing that mitigating characteristics provide leniency to the class of defendants with those characteristics is an observation, not an argument. To be sure, progressives like Dauber have self-induced myopia about the problematic U.S. prison state when defending harsh criminal sanctions intended to protect minorities. Take, for example, hate crime legislation, a perennial progressive carve-out, in the face of accumulating evidence that defendants of color are disproportionately subjected to hate crime enhancements incarceration critics are beginning to realize that criminalizing identity-based animists is a double-edged sword metaphor. In fact, the population of identity protecting criminal law has given states another weapon in the enforcement arsenal. In May 2016, the governor of Louisiana signed the Blue Lives Matter law, making Louisiana the first state to treat offenses against public safety workers as hate crimes. Now, so many ways I could look at that. Again, unexpected. I look back at that, but I mean, for real, non-white people are
for real.
Oh, is this another one where we get the double? Are black males most likely to be subjected to hate crime?
Yes, not most likely, but far more disproportionate to the share of population than whites. So I don't have the statistics at my fingertips. I could pull them up. But all right, so they did one of the, it's very hard to get good crime statistics, but probably the best we have are the various Department of Justice, Bureau of Justice statistics, collecting these reports in the database. So they did a victimization survey, and that's kind of how they measure hate crimes. And so when they crunched, who is committing hate crimes, the majority of victims of hate crimes were white, okay? Like something like 56% were white. And it was about evenly split between black and white perpetrators. And I think like 20% of the hate crime victims were black. So like, who are all these white people claiming to be hate crime victims? Well, it turned out to be like a lot of women who believe that gender crimes are hate crimes, which technically they're not. And, LGBTQ, white, which, can be subject to hate crimes. So what you're getting in these hate crime laws sweeping in is any time something is plausibly on the basis of race. So imagine that there is a rival gang fight, or imagine that, two guys were getting in a fight and they're slinging insults at each other, right? Now, and imagine then that like the only people who are really being monitored for whether there are fights where people are slinging racialized insults at each other are in the neighborhoods designated high crime neighborhoods. And studies consistently confirm that what the police designate as a high crime neighborhood has very little to do with the actual level of crime there, and everything to do with the percentage of blacks in the population, or the socioeconomic status, or whether it's perceived as a poor black neighborhood. So this is just true. So they go into these areas, and they're the ones sort of policing the fights and policing the skirmishes and stuff. And if racial epithets are uttered even between two people of color, right, like say, black person, Latino person, or just in the course of the fight, that can be a hate crime. Right? And so if you've got, this is becoming very popular in San Francisco, where you have, these disputes. Like there was recently this dispute with, a few years back, where there was, and I don't know if the person was of color, but where there was a little boy who, was like riding his bike on the sidewalk or something, and then, for example, an Asian man like yelled at him, and he like hit the Asian man with a plastic bat that like an 11-year-old kid had, and the question of whether that's a hate crime, right? Like, and it was argued that it should be charged as a hate crime. So with things going on like that, right, you can imagine why hate crime laws, in the name of putting white supremacists in jail, have ended up disproportionately enhancing the sentences of people of color, of black and brown men. That has happened, and it shouldn't be surprising, because it's just police power. It's prosecutorial power. It's another way to induce pleas. It's another way to stack charges, right? And all of this power does not flow evenly, right? So when I tell my students this about hate crimes, I have to like show them the statistics because they won't believe it. But, every time the legislature passes a law, and it could be in the name of something really good. Yeah, of course we want to stop hate. Of course we want to stop rape. Of course we want to stop DV. But every time they do it, it's just generally an accrual of power to the carceral state, which we know is infested with racism. And so we shouldn't be surprised that even the anti-racist criminal laws and prosecution turn out to be racist.
Well, I don't want to say stupefied or speechless or even surprised, but I mean, as someone who's had a podcast for 13 years and we've talked to all these folks, I've never heard anyone explain, oh yes, Gus, even the hate crime laws are disproportionately applied to black people. Even you too could be charged as hate crime. Oh my God. We had a straggler, do you have time to nab our caller in Southern California? I think this might be the person that recommended your book. Do you have a moment to get her question?
Sure, no problem.
Let's see. 1159. Do you have a question for Professor Aya Gruber?
Greetings, Gus. Greetings, callers and listeners.
Sorry.
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir. We can hear you.
Can I be heard? Miss Guest, how do feminists work against racism, white supremacy?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are groups like, and sort of groups that are helmed by feminists of color who are, and it's sort of coalescing into a name, abolition feminists, for example, who actually believe in that abolition feminists who believe it's a feminist project to try to dismantle the penal state, like the mass incarceration system. And so this is something that they consider not just a racial justice enterprise, but also a feminist enterprise. Because, policing and prison and prosecution is often done in the name of women, read kind of like white women. But when you really look at it, some of the worst mistreatment women get is at the hands of these actors, these state actors. So yes, there are many burgeoning and growing feminist projects that are very distinctly racial justice projects that focus on, women of color, that focus on the state, that focus on economic inequality, and in reforming policing and imprisonment, or even tearing it down. And like me, the other caller said, do you consider yourself a feminist? I do. I do want to see where there's oppression against people on the basis of their gender. I do want to see that stopped. I don't think that's, controversial. What is controversial is kind of the specific program. And you see a lot of activists and theorists and lawyers who are dedicated to, eradicating the oppression of women, also engaged in these racial justice projects because they are, in fact, related more than they're in conflict. But again, the brand of feminism that has ascended is the one that was perfectly willing to sacrifice the interests of many people of color. Again, maybe some of it was unintended, or it did, like, they just didn't realize how bad the problem is or how complicit it would be. But it is, we are where we are now with feminism, and you see a lot of feminists now actively working against it. In fact, a critical mass of feminists think that mandatory domestic violence arrests, shouldn't be a policy, that they should stop doing that. But it's very hard, even though now, a lot of the feminists who are the architects of it don't think there should be mandatory arrests. But now it's, become an entrenched part of the system, and no politician or, police captain or somebody running for DA wants to run on undoing the, woman protecting domestic violence laws. So it's like, what I try to say to some of the young feminists is don't do the reform in the first place. Think really hard before you advocate the criminal law reforms, because once they're in place, they're pretty hard to reverse.
That answer your question, sir? Not hearing you being said.
Yeah. I did hear that answer.
Okay.
Are these feminists, are they saying that they are working against the system of white supremacy, or are they just doing things that you believe that it's working against the system?
Oh, I think they are. I mean, like Angela Y. Davis, Critical Resistance, Miriam Kaba, these are black feminists, and they are actively working against the prison industrial complex that is one of the biggest sort of drivers and purveyors of white supremacy. So, I mean, and they're definitely, I think both racial justice advocates and feminists. So, I mean, I think so. I don't think they're mutually exclusive things, being a feminist. In fact, I find it kind of like sad that so many people do see them as mutually exclusive things. I think that's a really bad thing.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Much obliged.
For the question.
Oh, we've been chatting it up. The book, The Feminist War on Crime, The Unexpected Role of Women's Liberation in Mass Incarceration, with Professor Aya Gruber. We'll definitely have to continue. Keep an eye on more of your work. I guess folks can tune in next Monday, 7 days, if we are alive that long. Kyla Schuler, The Trouble with White Women. I think some of these issues will be revisited. I think Ms. Schuler's. Have you read that book, The Trouble with White Women? Have you checked that one out, Professor?
No, but I want to.
Okay.
No, I haven't read it yet. Yeah.
Okay. Looking forward to next week.
It's
Anywho,
something I've got to read very soon.
Reading more important than watching television. Lots to read. It has been a hoot. I'm so glad we could have you on the program. I hope our listener who recommended your work was able to hear the broadcast. But thank you so much for hanging out with us this Monday evening to discuss your work. Hopefully we can have you back on the broadcast to continue the dialogue. Also wanted to make sure I pointed out before you exit, man, that's somewhat historic. We've had a number of listeners ask for years about who is more confused about racism, white supremacy. We've done over 2,000 programs. We don't even have 5 people who has said that they think white people are not confused. Like almost everyone says white people are confused. It is like, Sue, I only need one hand and I would have extra fingers to count the number of guests who said, oh no, white people are not confused about racism. That is like, wow. Nope. Asterisk in the history of the cows. But thank you so much again, Professor Aya Gruber. It has been a hoot. Learned a lot from your book.
Thank you so much for having me, and thanks for having such a great show.
Much obliged. Enjoy your evening and take great care.
Okay, take care.
For sure. Context of White Supremacy. The Feminist War on Crime, the unexpected role of women's liberation in mass incarceration. We will take a short break and then we'll check in, see if folks have any thoughts on what they heard. Make sure folks have the schedule for when we will be here for the remainder of the week. Give us 2 minutes. We'll check back in. Context of White Supremacy. We'll be right back.
And from the late 1960s, after the death of Martin Luther King and the riots and the upheavals and all like this, and black people with their fists in the air and all like that and trying to stumble and fumble and find their way and get focus, the white supremacists made a blueprint and put it in action. And that is, I'm going to have these people so confused, they don't even know what they started out to do. And by the late 1970s, they had just about completed it. And we've been on that ever since. And you mentioned something very important. They are more comfortable than ever. But see, it's like making gorillas comfortable in a cage, or monkeys, or pandas. You still got them in a cage, but they're comfortable. See, so give him some bling bling. It's like giving an animal a brand new car and training the animal to ride up and down the street in it. And then you stand back and point at the animal. Like one white man said in the late 1950s. He said he doesn't care what kind of car a Negro has. He said he's still a nigger. And when he rides by in a shiny car, to him, it's just a monkey in a car. White people built a car, put a monkey in it, trained the monkey to drive the car, so now you're looking at a monkey in a car. See, but black people don't see themselves that way. But this is how the white supremacists see us, and they are the ones who run our business. And we have to know that when they look at us, that's what they see. That's what they see. That's what they see. And at a subliminal level, what they see begins to spill over into our brains so that we, at a subliminal level, see each other that way. And indirectly see ourselves that way.
Context of White Supremacy. Let us see. One, we'll be here on Thursday, minimum. Book Club, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. Reading The Man in the High Castle, second audio segment. Lots of people read. It was like landslide in terms of listeners who wanted to read this book. So there should be robust participation. No reason to vote for a book if you're not going to participate. 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. The Man in the High Castle. Thankfully, this is a short book, so we'll be done. This is not one of those, we'll have to be listening to it for 3-4 months. Like, it's very short. I think we should be done by next month. New book. That's Thursday, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. Before I get to the details of today's broadcast, wow, it's so right on time. I was going to share it with Professor Gruber, but I was trying to, cover as much as we could, get to as many callers as we could, and, cover material from the book. So, but I started today. I said before, Seattle spoiled. They have like 20 different library branches for Seattle Public Library. I've not even been to all of the branches. I've done like half. I hadn't even done half until the past 12 months or so. Anyway, so today I ventured to one of the branches I've never visited before, Greenwood, even though I've been in this area many, many times, just never been to the library in this part of town. So I go to the library. I'm going to walk in the front entrance. They have a display, huge display right out front. You can see this image. I have it on my social media. You can see it on Facebook and Twitter at Until Justice. If you want to see the image, but they have a huge display. And it features all of these books, Negro History Month, all of these books, 20 different authors, all black females. And they have Nicole Hannah-Jones, the 1619 Project, Cowbell, White Parent. They have Michelle Alexander, the New Jim Crow, Cowbell. They have one of our favorites, Angie Thomas, not the Hate You Give, which would also be a cowbell, but the follow-up. And then they had Isabel Wilkerson Case, Cowbell, and Second Worst Book Ever. We read that on the book club. And Bell Hooks, and some other folks. But exclusively Janet Mock, exclusively black females. This is the second time I've visited Seattle Public Libraries where they've had a Black History Month display that exclusively featured black females, totally excluded black authors, and I mean a display that featured more than a dozen books, authors. The last time I said something, they changed it. and I spoke with a non-white librarian. This time, I asked to speak to the Greenwood library manager. It is a white woman, Emily Grayson. She says, "Oh, I'm the person who constructed the display." And I said, "Well, it's for Black History Month?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Well, there are no black male authors. You couldn't find one?" I didn't ask for half, right? Not trying to be greedy, patriarchal, toxic black. It's 20. You couldn't find one black male author to feature? And she said, "Well, you know, Women's History Month is next month, and we wanted to do something that focuses on black females." Now, again, this is the second time I've seen a display at Seattle Public Library that exclusively featured black females. I've never seen such a display featuring exclusively black males. So I say, She says, "Well, Women's History Month is next month, and so we wanted something that could kind of just lead in. We could leave it up for 2 months." So I said, "So is it laziness that you just wanted to put something up and then not have to change it for March?" He said, "Oh, no, that's not it." I said, "Okay. So do you ever display anything that exclusively features black males to combat black misandry? Because that's a part of white supremacy." He says, No, we don't do that. We're trying to work against racism. We do that, Seattle Public Library, but we also think it's important to work against misogyny. Really? So black males can't be displayed at all. No voice. Black males. And Seattle Public Library, it's on record. Seattle Public Radio did a report recently about Seattle Public Library. They have a racism problem with black people being kicked out, that D word, disproportionately, and particularly, same thing we just heard from Professor Aya Gruber, particularly with black children. They almost exclusively kick out black children, and that's one, I bet any amount of money you want is nigger boys who get booted out of Seattle Public Library. But they just did a report about this as a problem that Seattle Public Library is supposed to be working on. So not only black people and black children in particular get booted out of the library, black boys go, and they can't even see a black male author. I didn't say a dozen. I didn't say 15. I said a single black male author on display for Black History Month. So I said, can you, explain to me, like, what is the rationale? Because she said it was done consciously. She didn't say this was unexpected. She just, oh my goodness, I didn't know I left out all the nigger males. She said this was done deliberately. I said, so can you maybe email what the rationale is for this, how this is constructive to do things where you totally exclude black males and feature black females who are critical of black males. So it's not just you don't get a voice at all. You're going to be criticized, projected as misogynists. That's the only way that you can even be considered, and you can't speak for yourself. Can you maybe articulate to me how that's constructive? Like, what's the benefit of that? How that's even supposed to be welcoming for black males who want to visit the library? She said she's not willing to write it down, not willing to make a change. I said, no problem. The president, the interim executive director of the Seattle Public Library is Tom Fay, Tom Fay. His email is chieflibrarian@spl.org. I'm going to email Tom Fay and the rest of the Seattle executive branch to let them know not only do I not feel welcome, that's a big part of the mission statement at Seattle Public Library. I do not feel welcome specifically as a black male. I'm only thought of as a misogynist at the Seattle Public Library. But then this is they call it recidivism. Is there an institutional bias, misandry against black males? Are you doing something to address this? Because this seems to be, like I said, this is not the first time. Totally different branch where we'll do something to address black people, but we have to leave out the nigger males. White woman, and a white woman, the authority on Black History Month, proud to put up this display to address misogyny and Racism. Again, the interim executive director and chief librarian, Tom Fay. His email is chieflibrarian@spl.org. You can drop an email, consider it like an investment in the cows. Send them an email and share your thoughts on Black misandry and why that is a major component of white supremacy racism. I'm surprised they didn't have Alice Sebold's Lucky up there. Maybe they'll put that up for March Women's History Month. And in addition, I was going to share with our guests because they do not have the Feminist War on Crime in the Seattle Public Library system at all. Like, they can talk about all this nonsense with misogyny and no-count toxic, patriarchal, privileged black males, but misandry and how black males are routinely the most victimized in all areas of people activity? No, that can't be addressed at all. And in fact, we can't even find one book or feature one book discussing authored by black males. Couldn't even get Will Smith's book. We can't Will Smith's book and put it. Oh, that's right. He's a toxic, sexic black male too. He was in the King Richard, The Audacity, being a film, and then not name it after Serena and Venus. Yes. Chief Librarian at spl.org. If you have 5 minutes to send an email, Black Misandry. Let's see. The program that we heard today, I learned quite a bit. Hate crimes, isn't that something? But it just, for me, it really enforced, like, wow, concepts. I don't hear a hue and cry of people saying that I'm a misandrist. It's a disgrace how they treat old Anthony Broadwater. It's a disgrace how they treat the Central Park Five. It's a disgrace what they do. Emmett Till, all of them. It's a disgrace. Khalif Brown. I'm a misandrist. I'm out. I'm caping for black. I don't hear that. So in my view, it would be best to go about the business of justice. Anytime I look at Feminist Scholar, like you can go back in the archives and hear it. When I even hear the word feminist, I feel like they should place white in front of it, which I guess did at a number of points, because that's really what you mean. There are a number of so-called black people, males and females, who identify as so-called feminists every single time. Like, wow. In a system of white supremacy racism where black misandry is so central in so many ways, you are aligning with white women. And the ideology, we talked about that with Yurugu, the racist ideology of white feminism, which is really just about their power struggle with white men for who is going to have more control of niggers and resources and the spoils of terrorizing non-white people worldwide. That's really all this is about. White men, the racial contract, Charles W. Mills, guest on the program, they are in agreement. They may squabble with each other, fight about who has how much control and territory. White people do that all the time. That has nothing to do at all with non-white people, victims of racism, white supremacy. I would just say it shows the degree. Things spill over, Mr. Fuller said, things spill over from how racists think. It spills over, if you want to use that metaphor. And I mean, wow, white people have been so aggressive with marketing their so-called feminist concepts. Wow. It is amazing. Black males are not perfect, neither are black females. Black males could do a lot to improve our behavior, so could black females. But wow, all of this white feminism, this is exactly what you can expect. Something that ends up with that no-count O.J. Simpson and the no-count of raping black males. They need to be caged and castrated and beaten and killed. Maybe not in that order. That's about what I would expect from white. And in fact, she can talk all that about white anti-racists right now. I don't see any evidence of that. This problem would be solved. All of that talk about gun violence in New York right now. New York Mayor Adams was just talking about bail reform. Got nigger children out here. Black males raping and shooting police officers. Let's see how much reform continues. Let's see. Let's even watch some of these elections as they proceed. But I mean, if white people are serious about prison reform. Matter of fact, prison reform, let's take the low-hanging fruit metaphor. They were talking about cannabis. I'm in Washington State. They said that's going to be legalized. That'll help keep niggers out of prison. In California, LA Times, they just had a really massive and lame report about how, wow, we have done a really poor job going back and getting non-white people who got all these lame cannabis charges, nonviolent arrests, and all the rest of it, and messed up their record, and can't get public housing and certain scholarships and all the rest of it. We haven't done anything to go back and expunge things from their records now that this has been decriminalized and you got tons of white people making millions. Hasn't been addressed at all. I thought that was a big part of why we would decriminalize. We get to that. It's been, in Washington State, it's been a decade. In California, it's encroaching on a decade of legalization. And we'll get to it. I said that. You can go back in the archives because we were on the air there. I said that. All that was nonsense. The lip service to decriminalizing and criminal reform. Yeah. White people lie. The other thing I'll say, I thought it was so fascinating about Unexpected, her sharing. She didn't have that in the original title. That the publishers added it on. That she said she wasn't sure if it was a white person specifically. It could have been a group thing, that sort of thing. The publishing industry in aggregate is dominated by white women. So I don't know if it was a non-white person directly who may have been the one, to tell her she needed to add that word to soften it. They're going to be upset. If anything, that just shows the power, vitriol really, but the power of white women. That what? You're going to write something criticizing what? Talking about white women as racist? What? And she doesn't even say that a whole lot in the book, like white women being racist, Like a lot of times it'll be second wave feminists and, like she was saying, 70s feminists and that type of thing. I don't think she has that anywhere in the book, even though it would be super appropriate the whole way through. In fact, it should be the White Feminist War on Crime, or even White Women's War on Crime would be super accurate. I forgot to ask about O.J. Simpson. That's one big mistake. I should have asked about that because I had O.J. in the intro. Anywho, folks who dialed in, we can get to all of the folks who dialed in with a question. Don't wait till the last minute if you have a question. Hands up early. It helps me, among other things, it helps me organize the program. People have their hand up early as opposed to waiting until I'm ready to let the guest leave and then 3 or 4 people put their hand up. Like, come on, man. Waiting until the last 2 hours, especially if you called in late, like, oh man, do not call in like 30 seconds before, the top of the second hour or whatever. Like, oh man, I need to get my, come on. Or if you do, maybe we get to you, maybe we don't. Folks have commentary they wanted to share before we get ready to wrap up.
Greetings, everyone.
Retired firefighter in Florida. Guest, I believe, was down in your part of the world, South Florida.
Yeah, I thought I heard her say something about Miami. I wasn't sure on which Miami she was referring to because she didn't give any connections about South Florida in general, with names or anything like that. But I wasn't real eager to ask a question. I was more or less just kind of like paying attention indirectly. But I was going to, if I was chosen to ask a question, I was going to ask her since this issue, this articulation that she was bringing up about when she was asked about her racial classification. I was going to ask on whether or not her parent or parents or guardian, when they were writing in her racial classification for some reason, what did they put down? I was just thinking about Rachel Dolezal at the time. I'm just wondering on what she would have said. What would have been her answer to that? And also, the second question I was going to ask, being that in these lucrative sports entertainment businesses, whereas the head football coach, especially in Miami, in all large cities, is equivalent to the mayor, at least the mayor of that city. In other words, if that person is invited or goes to a school, everybody in the school would stop what they're doing to be entertained by this person who's the head football coach of the Miami Dolphins. I'm lately hearing the terms by the NFL, especially after this lawsuit, terms like people of color, minority, what's another one? It's a few more. And I was gonna ask her, are they the person they selected? This person they selected as the head football coach, like her, is well, I didn't hear him identify himself as such, but they're identifying him as something called biracial, whatever that means exactly. And I just wanted to get her comments from that, being that if she did stay in Miami, she would probably know something about this recent issue, and what would her thoughts be on this? Mind you, now when they're looking for the gladiator level, most of these guys look like they're from the Congo. They're so melanated. But when it comes to any other profiting employment, that person is a white person, or fill in these different confusing terms like biracial or person of color, that sort of thing. That's the refinement period of racism, white supremacy. Just wanted to know her thoughts on that, and that's it. Thank you. Oh yeah, one more thing. I'm going to start calling you Gus X if you're going to be writing all of these notations to Seattle's libraries. That's it. Thank you.
Much obliged. Retired firefighter in Florida. Effort to, counter racism, small things that you can do sometimes, just asking questions. That's a little bit that you can do.
Yes, sir. Keep it up. Keep it up. Yes, sir.
Do what you can. That's what they say. Do what you can. The racial classification confusion is a big one. I put a picture of the guest up on the social media, Facebook and all that, so people can, if you haven't, or you can do the search and all that to see what the guest looks like. But I thought that was really important. Like when I saw, I think Z's mom, she mentioned the book we were reading, Lucky and all that, and so I went, saw the book and all that. I didn't see the professor until like way down the road. I think it was when I got the book. That was when I got the book, hard copy, flipped it over, and they had a color picture of her on the back, and I looked and was like, whoa. She looks like, exactly the word she said, she could pass as white. She looks exactly like, whoa. Now, sometimes, like I think I've heard Mr. Fuller say, depending on like the lighting, or if you see somebody when they have their summer color, people that remember Crystal Tyler, maybe they look a little darker. Now, if you look online and see some of the other photos, she looks, how would I say, a little more Asian. She looks like she, I don't know, maybe got a tan, or maybe the lighting was different. She looks maybe a little darker, not super dark, but just a little bit. And then you see some of the features phenotypically like, Yeah. The way I try to gauge it is like, so, man in the high castle. So if race soldiers came in, said, if you don't have a white person with you right now, give you a pass, you're going to die. I'm not going to her for my pass. Like, they might kill both of us. I'm going to get somebody else. I don't know if you're going to stand up to, test enough, because this is serious. That would be the way I would adjudicate it. Although I super appreciated her saying that for racists, they will manipulate to their advantage. Sometimes we'll accept her as white. Sometimes, nah, get over there. It's not to our advantage. You're with the niggers. That is remembering who does the deciding about who is classified as white, who is not.
Who is not.
Let's see. Other folks, commentary to share. 10 minutes before we wrap things up.
Can I hear?
Tapello, yes, sir.
Oh, I'm sorry. I must be muting myself and turning it on and off. I've got this new phone. Sorry about that, Gus. Trying to deal with that and this technology and call you on to the show and get on late and have problems trying to get in and out. And I was hearing the lady speak, and I was getting confused on some things, so I have to listen to the podcast again. But she kept saying Latinos or Latinas, and I just wanted to ask if everyone is getting mistreated, and at the bottom of that ladder are known as black people, then what was the difference between the Latino and a black person? And I just want to hear what she would say from her point of view. But I came in late, so I wasn't sure what you said about anything prior to that, obviously. So I just listened to the commentary mostly. And I'm not sure if she really even answered questions by some of the callers when it came down to what a feminist is worth to black people. As the people that are the most to be mistreated. I'm trying to understand what would be the goal of a black woman wanting to be a feminist in such a system. If she as a black person will be mistreated, regardless if she's a woman. I haven't found out that advantage yet. At least I haven't heard it. I haven't heard it explained logically. And then I heard her say she would classify the writer from, or the newspaper lady from Memphis, name escapes my mind right now. Classify her as a feminist. Somebody help me with the name.
Ida B. Wells?
Ida B. Wells. Mrs. Ida B. Wells as a feminist. And I'm thinking to myself, I would never classify her as a feminist. I thought I think it's an insult, to tell you the truth. I also wouldn't classify Sojourner the Truth as a feminist after she was scorned by the white women who were feminists. and led to believe she was part of the clique, and well, she held her skepticism, and I don't think she was surprised at how she was treated afterward by the white women. So neither of these women I would consider a feminist, and I would really be interested in what writings or speeches that they gave that would lead one to believe that they were feminist. But I am limited in my education, and also she gave me confusion when she said she feels like she's not white, or yeah, I think she said that, right? That she's not white. She feels that she's not white, or that she was white. But I heard her say that, and I was really confused by that statement. So she gave me a lot of confusion. I have to listen to her again and the show again, the callers' questions, because I missed a lot of things. That's it. Greetings, everyone. Greetings, Gus. I know you're having fun out there in Seattle with your encounters with the librarians. I also used to live out there, and I know exactly what you're dealing with. But lead on, sir. You're doing a good job with the show, with the program. And I'm glad you're still on. Someone else can get on in.
Can I be heard?
Yes.
Greetings again. Thank you for, taking my call, and thank you for having the guest on. A long-time listener. I think this may have been my first or second time calling in. Two things. First, I have been to the Seattle Public Library, I believe, in downtown. I kind of did a little project. I'm originally from California, but I was in Seattle at the time. Tried to get the code book in there because I heard you can, go to any kind of library, request it, and they'll get it. So I had two attempts. The first attempt, I will admit, I did lie. I did say I was living in the area, but I don't live in the area. I did have an address, but I just didn't live in the area. So my second attempt, I saw my error, and I said this time I'm not going to lie or give incorrect information. I spoke with some of the non-white workers. What options do I have of getting this book? I visit often. I'm trying to get the book into the library. What are my options? They were helpful, but, very limited information. Spoke to two different non-white workers, employees, black male and then a non-white female. I got directed to a white female. I guess she's an actual librarian. And she was very resistant to getting the book. They told me the book wasn't available in the library. She looked it up, and as soon as she did that, I knew it was just resistance. At one point, she tried to take my information down to record it, and I thought that was very strange because it seems like I should take your information down, right, to see if he'll follow up on it. I don't know why you need my information. I asked her that, and, I can't remember the response she gave me at the time, but it didn't justify taking my information down. So all in all, did not get the book in there, and I think they will not have the book in there. On a different note, following the program tonight, I found it very interesting for her response of whether or not non-white people should participate in feminism, even after all of the research she's done and the massive amount of mistreatment and abuse non-white people have received due to so-called feminism. He still believes that non-white people should participate in it. So I found that to be very interesting. I guess she is non-white, so I don't want to criticize her too much, I guess. But I thought that was very interesting. Other than that, I don't really have anything else. Just a suggestion for maybe a different guest. I don't know if this is the correct time to do that or not. But Dr. David Ansel, author of The Death Gap, very interesting work, definitely practicing racism, white supremacy. But that's all I have for tonight. Thank you for taking my call.
Much obliged. We will check that out. Reading more important than watching television. I reckon if I had anything to say, we've been on the air so long. So interesting. She says she's so-called biracial. We missed the program. We were supposed to be on air last Tuesday. We were supposed to have Sarah Donahue, who talks about also being so-called biracial. She was not on the program, didn't, respond, didn't hear back from her. We had some tech issues as well. Like she called in for the program, but got disconnected. She didn't exactly call back in with haste, like there wasn't a sense of urgency on her part, but she also identifies as biracial. Anyway, for years, I have said, hey, it's significant. If this person is classified as non-white, victim of white supremacy, that's logic. However, if they have a white parent, that has an enormous impact on their thought, speech, action, as it would for anyone. Your parent, hey, birth, all of that. But you have a white parent, that is going to impact how you think about white people. Even once with all that information about racism, white supremacy, and especially if you are pale enough that you can be accepted as white, like, oh man, that's going to have a huge impact. That's why I was really glad to get all that information out in detail. And I think she said that in getting all of this information, it impacted her. She was talking about being a feminist. All of the ideology of white women, really the thinking of white women and how they view the world. So it does not surprise me at all. Like I said for myself, I cannot untangle the two. Feminism is just racism, white supremacy from the perspective of white women. It is all about Carolyn Bryant Donham. She was mentioned, the white woman who lied, Wolf Whistle, Emmett Till, all of that, who is still alive, not prosecuted as a murderer. That right there, white feminism, just different generations, different refinements of the same behavior. Anywho, that is our 3 hours. We will call it a broadcast there. We will be here at minimum on Thursday, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific for the book club, The Man in the High Castle. Much obliged to Z's mom for the suggestion. If you didn't hang out with us for Lucky, Alice Sebold, oh, wow. It's everything about this. And that book, a part of women's studies programs and the Me Too and all the rest of it. And, oh, my gosh, the oppression and sexism and all the rest of it. Usual, she said the religion of white supremacy. She said, talking about these angelic, deified white women, just like Ramona Lofton, Sapphire, just like she said in the poem Wild Thing, army of sin, talking about the black males. And then the image I mentioned, Greenwood, Seattle Public Library, where they can get books from everywhere. I've gotten books I got books from California delivered. Never had a problem. I'm not surprised they couldn't get the code books, but oh yeah, misogyny, That's the problem. That's what we got to deal with. Yes, misogyny. And caste, yes. Cowbell. Anywho, much obliged for folks participating. Hope it was worthy of your Monday evening. Sobriety would be best. That's a big theme in Aya Gruber's book. So much of the campus rape people being under the influence. She talks about that over and over, and how, wow, a lot of these white women, if they were really concerned, especially about the college rapes, like, man, you all should be the ones. Sobriety would be best. Like, let's do something about all this underage drinking and narcotics consumption. Like, hey, let's be front and center about that. That doesn't seem to be the case. That would have a huge impact. That's at least one thing non-white parents can do, like talk to your offspring. Sobriety, all these Me Too and colleges and Title IX, alcohol. In addition to being sober, if you're out and about, you see someone being rowdy, hostile, exit, you should be thinking that they could be armed. If you didn't leave your residence prepared to kill and or die, exit. They may have an entire armed entourage ready to kill the no-count toxic raping black male. If you're in a vehicle, you're sober, buckled, not on the phone, doing the small things we can to minimize contact with the race soldiers, badge or no. All of that said, Creator, we ask that you help us remain patient with other black people, victims of white supremacy. We ask that you help us remain patient with ourselves. Remind us to demonstrate the highest levels of black self-respect at all times, in all places, each and every time we are in contact with another black person. It has been time. Replace white supremacy with justice immediately. Cal signing out. Thanks all for tuning in.